my name is Ryan. I'm a tutor in the Econ Tutoring Center. Today I'm going to go over some macroeconomics review questions, and I'll go over an old practice exam and some of those problems to help you prepare a little bit for an exam, or just in general some of these topics we'll be talking about. Remember that the language and notation that I'll be using might differ from your professors, so always just check to make sure that notation and language is the same. Okay, so we're going to go over a practice exam here and some of the problems for using this old macro exam. Okay, so productivity, the first question says productivity is the amount of goods and services, and it has a couple options here. So the first one says that an economy produces. Right, so that's not true because productivity isn't about the total amount. It's how efficiently they produce things. So the amount per hour, the amount an individual worker produces per hour, right? So right, that's going to be one of these two then, correct? Right, because we don't care about how much the overall economy produces. We care about how efficient an individual worker is, and that's how we compare productivity between different workers, different groups of workers. And that is indeed linked to a nation's economic policies, right? Because if we have certain policies that, subsidize production of, or subsidize technology in a particular field, then workers can be more efficient. So that's D. Okay, our next question says that in 2009, the imaginary nation of mainland was a population of 7,000, and the real GDP had a population of 7,000 and a real GDP of 210,000. In 2010, the population was 7,300 and real GDP of 223,380. Over the last year, real GDP per person in mainland grew by blank, right? So first thing we do here is we're going to want to calculate GDP real GDP per person in the 2 years, and then we can find the percentage change between the two numbers. So so GDP per capita or per person, I'll say per capita, right, is just equal to GDP divided by the population, right? So in 2009, that's going to be 210,000 divided by 7,000, right? In 2010, that's going to be 223,380 over 7,300, right? And if you do these numbers, that's going to get you 30, and this gets you 30.6. Right, so now we're just going to use this percentage change formula, which is new, right, minus old, divided by old, right? So in this case, that's 30.6. So the GDP per capita in 2010, 30.6 minus 30 divided by 30, right, which is 0.6 over 30, which is going to be approximately 0.02. So 2% growth. So it's obviously one of these first two answers, and the kind of growth fact that we have from actual data is that indeed 2% is pretty normal over the last 100 years in the U.S. For annual per capita GDP growth. Okay, so the third question says productivity is defined as the quantity of, and then it gives you some answers here. And like I said earlier, that it's the amount of goods or services and the amount of output produced per unit of labor, right? So it's saying that how effective or how productive is that individual unit of labor, per hour or per whatever your unit is. And in that case, it's C. It could be per, productivity. You could have productivity of capital or labor. So in this case, we're talking about the particular input of labor. Okay, so furniture uses 12 workers each, working 8 hours to produce 192 rocking chairs. What is Phoenix's productivity? Right, so it's not 192 rocking chairs, because remember, we don't care about the overall amount of output. We care about how effective in a single unit of input is in producing output. And we can check 24 rocking chairs here. I think that's going to be 192 rocking chairs divided by 8 hours is 24 rocking chairs, right? So that tells us how many rocking chairs they produce per hour. But again, from the last problem, that's not what productivity is. We care about per labor input, right? So it's not this 24 number here, right? So, and we don't care about, in fact, we don't care about the amount of hours per rocking chair, right? We care about how much output we produce for a given number of inputs, right? So that's not the answer either. So obviously the answer is C, and the reason for that is that the time unit that we care about now is hours, right? So we already found out that 192 over 8 gives you 24 rocking chairs per hour, and then our input are workers, right? So if in a particular hour 12 workers produce 24 rocking chairs, then the productivity of each worker is 2 rocking chairs per hour, right? So they have that as their fix an hour, and in this particular country, 1 worker can produce you, or in this particular economy, I guess Phoenix, 1 worker can produce you 2 rocking chairs. Okay, industrial machinery is an example of a factor of production that in the past was an output from the production process. B, technological knowledge. That's certainly not true because we're talking about machinery. Right, a production function, it's going to be an input in a production function. Production function, gives you given inputs, produces outputs, right? So total output. So that's not what machinery is, right? An item which has always had the property called constant returns to scale. So we don't know if industrial machinery has this property of constant returns to scale, right? We assume that a production function does, whereas if I scale up the input, so I double the amount of labor that I have, say, and double the amount of capital that I put in, or whatever your inputs are, you'll double the output. So yeah, the production function has this trait, has this property called constant returns to scale, but not necessarily machinery, right? So that leaves us with A being the right answer, and the machinery is used to produce other goods. So that's just the way that in this particular question they decided to describe this thing. Okay, so which of the following is an example of human capital? The comfortable chair in your dorm, so human capital is kind of your entire set of skills that you have acquired, right? And that'll assign a different level, and then depending on your level of human capital, you can produce a certain output with that, right? So if you're human capital, if you go to law school or something, you acquire this human capital that allows you to produce the output or produce the service of being a lawyer. So that's kind of what the idea of human capital is versus physical capital, which would just be like machines, right? So that immediately eliminates D. That doesn't make any sense there. Any capital goods that require a human present, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about human capital. The amount that you get paid, that's just compensation. And the comfortable chair you get in your dorm room is obviously not human capital either. So the answer here is, of course, the things you've learned this semester, right? Because the idea is that as you acquire knowledge, you're able to produce more of a good or a service, which is the idea of human capital. Okay, so the next question says technological knowledge, and then it gives us options here, right? It's a determinant of productivity. Let's just circle C there, because obviously if you have more technological knowledge, then given an amount of time, you can produce more output. 8 here. Okay, so this is a question about constant returns to scale. So country A has twice as many workers as country B, as well as twice as much human capital and twice as much access to natural resources. Assuming constant returns to scale, which of the following is higher in country A? Right. Okay, so remember that productivity, or rather that constant returns to scale says that if I scale up my inputs by twice, then I'm going to get twice as many outputs, right? So the amount of output per, unit of labor in this case, so, it's just Y over L is the same thing as 2Y over 2L, right? So our productivity, or our output per worker, hasn't changed at all. It's just saying that we doubled up the input, so of course we're going to have a higher output. But you're not going to have a higher output per worker because, you've just doubled the amount of workers and doubled the amount of output, so it's going to be the same. And productivity, similarly, if you fix our level of hours or whatever, at double what it was before, you have twice as much output, but again, it's per twice as many units of input. So it doesn't affect either productivity or output per worker. Okay, if all else equal, if there are diminishing returns, which of the following is true if a country increases its capital by 1 unit? Okay, output will rise by more than it did when the previous. So diminishing return says something like this. So if I have maybe capital and output, the relationship between these two things looks something like this. So you're always going to get more output for more capital, but you're going to get more output at a decreasing rate. So when I, right here, when I increase capital by a little bit, my output went up by, a lot. Whereas here, when I increase capital by the same amount, if I call this like the change in capital, that's the same. Because of this diminishing returns property, I get less output, so a smaller change in output, right? So that's exactly what this question's saying here. It says, if all else equal, if there are diminishing returns, which of the following is true if we increase capital by 1 unit? So in this case, if delta K is 1 unit, right? So output will rise, like I said before, so it's not either one of these. If you increase your capital, you're still going to get more output. It's just you're going to get, it's going to go up by less than it was for the previous unit because of this diminishing returns property, right? So if the first answer were true, then we would have increasing returns, which would look something like this. But that's not what we assume about the production function. Okay, next question says, the ketchup effect refers to the idea that, and for this one I'm going to kind of use the same graph that I used here in this previous question, where, if I invest a certain amount in capital, it's this diminishing returns thing, right? So if I invest a certain amount in capital, if I'm at a low output level, right, so like, a poorer country at Y, at Y1, if I invest, some amount delta K in capital, that I'll be able to grow faster from that same level investment to Y2. Whereas if I were a richer country at a higher level, say up here, right, that same investment isn't going to get me as much. So that's the idea that it's easier for a country to grow fast if you're at a lower level of output than if you're at a higher one. So that's B here, right? Okay, we'll move to the next question now. If you were to start a business delivering documents, you might need to purchase cell phones, bicycle, desks, and chairs. And this question's like the difference between consumption and investment, right? So investment, the difference between consumption and investment is direct investment into a business instead of like consumption of final goods produced by a business, right? So the idea being that obviously it's not one of these two, right? Because it's not consumption. And then if you raise, so the difference between these two questions, this one says if you raise the funds to purchase them from others, you are a saver. If you raise the fund, and this one says if you raise the funds to purchase them from others, you're a borrower. So the idea is that the answer is B, right? Because if I'm like raising funds, so like say I'm trying to start a business, right? And if I have to raise the funds from others, right, I borrow money from them or even a bank, let's say, at some interest rate, and then I use that money to invest, and then hopefully that investment pays off, like I showed on that other graph there, and increases output, and then you repay that. So you're a borrower in that case, not a saver. Okay, the primary economic function of the financial system is Okay, to keep interest rates low, that's not necessarily true because in some situations interest rates will be higher or lower depending on riskiness and other things like that, right? So that's not right. To provide expert advice to savers and investors, that's not the primary function. The primary function is, let's see, so to match one person's consumption expenditures with another person's capital expenditures. We don't really care that capital expenditures and consumption expenditures equal out, right? We know that consumption should be, some fraction of output, but we don't necessarily know that that's the same as capital expenditures. And match one person's savings with another person's investment. So that is the real point of the financial system, is that we have, as you'll see here in a sec, a supply of loanable funds and a demand for loanable funds, and some interest rate, given what that supply and demand in this particular market looks like. And so whoever wants loanable funds and whoever is willing to save and supply loanable funds to the market, they come to some sort of agreement at an interest rate, and that's the real purpose of this market. Okay, so this idea of crowding out occurs when, say, the government wants to stimulate the economy, so it has some stimulating fiscal policy. It spends a bunch and runs a budget deficit, right? Which, in theory, would increase aggregate demand and should, increase output and make the economy grow faster. But the problem is that this crowding out occurs because if they start competing for this, if the government starts competing for, loanable funds or in some sense, that you might have this effect where, the demand for funds to kind of run this budget deficit, because obviously they're going to have to get money from somewhere, which they get it from this market for loanable funds, right? They might that might increase the interest rate from, say, I1 to I2, which is going to crowd out some of that spending. So the idea is they spend money, and that should, end up stimulating the economy. But the problem is that at the same time that they do that, they increase the demand for loanable funds in order to run that budget deficit, which increases the interest rate, which in some sense then might crowd out private investment, which is, the answer kind of here described by A, right? The investment declines, private investment declines, because this spending had the unintended effect of raising interest rates in the market for loanable funds. Okay, so the slope of the supply of loanable funds curve represents, okay, so again, I'm going to draw that same, this is quantity of loanable funds. Right, the supply comes from people willing to save their money in banks or the banking system, and this plots interest rate, right, against the quantity of loanable funds. So the supply curve represents it's obviously a positive relation because the supply curve is positive sloping. So it's the positive relation between investment, not investment because investment comes from demand here, right? So supply of loanable funds says that more people are willing to save at a higher interest rate. So the answer is B. So the idea is that, if I'm going to get a 10% interest if I put my money in the bank, then I'm more willing to save money than if I only got a 5% interest rate. So that's why the supply curve is positive sloping, right? Because at a higher interest rate, there can be a higher quantity supplied of loanable funds because more people will say, hey, it's worth it to invest, or rather to save, excuse me. Okay, if there's a shortage of loanable funds, then, okay, so a shortage of loanable funds would say that, there's some, here's our demand for loanable funds or supply, right? The quantity demand of loanable funds is higher than the quantity supplied, right? It's just like a shortage in any other market, right? More people want loanable funds at this particular interest rate, which would, of course, result from an interest rate that's below the equilibrium interest rate. But more people at that interest rate want loanable funds than would be willing to supply it. So that's B here. I should say B. So that's the same idea with the shortage in basically any market, is that the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied. So in 2002, this question says, in 2002, mortgage rates fell and mortgage lending increased. So which of the following could explain both of these changes? Okay, so if we look at this now familiar curve with the supply of loanable funds and the demand of loanable funds, so that's your quantity of loanable funds, and this is your interest rate. Right, so the facts we have are that rates fell, so interest rates on mortgages fell, but the lending increased, so the quantity went up. And so one explanation for that, given this curve, so one shift that could make both of those things happen is if the supply curve shifted right, then our interest rate would fall from this one, and our quantity would increase. Right, so from Q1 to Q2, and from I1 to I2. Right, so that's what that shift would look like. Or that's one shift on this supply loanable funds market that would be consistent with those observations. So that the supply for loanable funds curve shifted rightward. Okay. So if a reform of the tax laws encourages greater savings, the result would be, okay, so again, one more time, we have supply, which comes from savings, and this is demand, which comes from investment, right? So if some law encourages greater savings, the effect is that the supply of loanable funds curve shifts to the right. Right, so now there's a greater supply of loanable funds from S to S prime, and what that does is it's going to yield a lower interest rate, from I1 to I2, and higher savings, or higher investment rather, from Q1. So the quantity supply and the quantity demand of loanable funds is going to go up from Q1 to Q2. Right, so you end up with lower interest rate and greater investment at Q2. The following, this is included in what economists call money, and this one's just kind of a definition, and it's just cash. Which of the following is a store of value? Okay, so this is different. This would be opposed to like commodity money or something. So cash and stocks in this case is the right answer. So the idea being that neither cash nor stocks have some intrinsic value to them. They're just kind of there as a means of counting or a means of storing value that can be translated to something more physical elsewhere. This question asks the opposite, right? So commodity money is something that does itself have intrinsic value. So gold or something, something that it itself is valuable to people rather than just paper that's used to represent value elsewhere. Okay, next question says, the Fed has the power to increase or decrease the number of dollars through the decisions of, and that's the Federal Open Market Committee makes these decisions to buy bonds, which can increase the money supply, and that's what the Federal Open Market, the FOMC, will do. They'll go out into the market and decide to purchase bonds to increase the money supply and indirectly affect interest rates. So the Federal Open Market Committee decides to increase the money supply, then the Federal Reserve and purchase bonds, right, which is going to increase the money supply. So that's the way that they put new dollars into circulation, is that they'll say, okay, well, people out there who own government bonds exchange those bonds for dollars, and that's one way of increasing the money supply. So that's A. Okay. The money multiplier equals, and this is just a definition again, it's 1 over R, where R is the reserve ratio for banks in the economy. So that's the idea that if someone's going to, say, if I'm going to increase the money supply by $100, right, the idea is that I might spend, or I might decide to, deposit that $100 somewhere. And then a bank has to save a certain fraction of that R that the federal government requires, and the bank can lend out the other $90, right? and then that person can spend that $90 on something, and then whoever receives that can save it again in the bank, and then the bank takes out whatever their required reserve ratio is again, and then they lend out the remaining money. So the idea is this process repeats itself, and so at the end, the amount that the money supply actually increases is given by this money multiplier, right, depending on what the reserve ratio is. Okay, so when the Fed purchases $1,000 worth of government bonds from the public, the U.S. money supply eventually increases by, and the idea is that, and just like from the previous question, that it will be something more than $1,000, right, because of that money multiplier idea, that when they put $1,000 out in the economy, someone will spend that money, and someone else will be on the receiving end of that, deposit it, then they can lend it out again, and someone else will spend that money. So that multiplier effect is the reason why that $1,000 worth of government bonds purchased up will lead to an increase in the money supply of greater than $1,000. Okay, a discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges banks for loans, right? So that's C. Okay. So when there's a reserve requirement, banks, the idea again is like if there's a reserve requirement of say 10%, then whatever money people have deposited in the bank, so say people have deposited $100 and there's a 10% reserve requirement, they have to keep at least $10 in reserves. They can hold more than that, but not less than that, right? So that's what that reserve requirement is. Okay, so to increase the money supply, they could, right, so sell government bonds is going to do that, because if they sell government bonds, that's going to decrease the money supply because they give out bonds and take back in money in exchange. Increase the reserve requirement also isn't the right answer, because increasing the reserve requirement will make more banks hold money in reserves, which will decrease that money multiplier effect that we talked about before. And so the answer is to auction more loans to banks, right? So if the Federal Reserve starts giving out more loans to banks, the banks have more money to lend, and that process of lending and borrowing, spending, and then someone else saving it again will repeat more often, so you'll increase the money supply. Okay, the classical dichotomy argues that changes in money supply affect both nominal and real interest rates, or nominal and real variables, sorry. So the classical dichotomy basically says that changes in money supply eventually, at least in the long run, in the theories, that won't affect real variables, right? So if you double the amount of money in the economy, then eventually prices are just going to double and wages will double and everything will adjust, so that the real value of things hasn't changed, just the nominal value, so like what the actual price says. So that's C. Okay, the velocity of money. So the velocity of money is just how much an average dollar is spent for a given time period. So in this case, if we're talking about a year, it's the average number of times that if you take a dollar, that it'll be respent. Okay, hopefully some of those questions helped you out a little bit. If you have any more questions, come to the Econ Tutoring Center.